The morning frost clung to the timber-framed windows of the Borderland Apothecary, thick enough to blur the silhouettes of the bare oaks outside. Inside, the air held the sharp medicinal scent of crushed pine needles, steeped willow bark, and the dusty sweetness of old honeycomb. Clara Vance did not mind the cold. She preferred it to the suffocating heat of the high court she had left behind long ago. The chill kept the herbs crisp and her mind entirely clear. Sitting at the long pine table in the center of the room, her hands moved with a practiced, rhythmic precision. Before her rested the drying comfrey basket, a woven willow container polished smooth by years of use. It was filled with the gnarled, blackened roots that sustained the local pack through the bitter northern winter. Reaching in, her fingers sifted through the brittle contents. She did not need to look down to know what she was holding. Her skin had learned to read the microtextures of the healing plants. A smooth, heavy root held the most mucilage, perfect for poultices to draw out infection from a wolf's torn muscle. A hollow, brittle piece was useless, damaged by early frost. She counted them silently, snapping the hollow stems and pushing the viable roots into a small ceramic bowl. 11th. 12, 13 good roots. It was not enough. Under the pale morning light that bled through the frosted glass, she paused to turn her hands over. They were not the hands of a lady anymore. The tips of her fingers were permanently stained a faint yellowish brown from handling iodine and dried sap. Small pale scars crossed her knuckles from where a frantic, injured pup had snapped at her 3 winters ago. They were hands built for utility, for survival, and for the quiet endurance required of an omega living on the very edge of the Oak Ridge territory. She traced the rough skin of her palm. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. Here, far from the capital, she did not have to perform obedience. She only had to perform her work. Picking up a small paring knife, its iron blade worn thin from constant sharpening, she began to shave the outer bark off the 14th root. The shavings fell away in crisp ribbons, curling onto the scarred wood of the table. Every ounce mattered. The winter was only beginning, and the poor wolves of the borderlands could not afford the expensive elixirs imported from the Central Territories. They relied entirely on what she could pull from the frozen earth and preserve in the drying comfrey basket. She swept the usable shavings into a small linen pouch, tying it shut with a piece of rough twine. Moving with deliberate economy was essential. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in a border clinic often meant an amputation or a lingering fever. Brushing the excess dust from her heavy woolen apron, she stood and walked toward the small iron stove. The embers from the previous night were still glowing faintly beneath the grey ash. She added 2 small blocks of seasoned cedar, watching as the heat caught the edges, sending a thin ribbon of fragrant smoke up the chimney. Clara moved from the stove to the small, slanted desk tucked beneath the window, wiping the herb dust from her hands onto a damp linen towel. She reached for the heavy leather-bound ledger resting on the corner of the desk. Its cover was worn smooth, the edges grease-stained from countless nights of tallying numbers by the light of a single tallow candle. This was the true pulse of her clinic, far more unforgiving than the injuries she treated. As she opened the book, the thick parchment pages crackled slightly in the cold air. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, tracing the exact trajectory of her depleting financial resources. The structural poverty of the outer territories was laid bare in these lines of black ink. The current high court taxation had drained the local economy, leaving the border wolves with barely enough coin to buy firewood, let alone medicine. Tracing the corner of the page with her thumbnail, she calculated the margins of survival. She had extended credit to the Miller family for their daughter's lung sickness. She had taken 3 sacks of root vegetables from the blacksmith instead of silver for setting his broken arm. The ledger reflected a system on the brink of collapse, held together only by barter and her own refusal to turn the injured away. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, the metal nib scraping softly against the bottom. The transfer of 2 copper pieces for a jar of burn salve was recorded. The amount entered with neat, uncompromising strokes. The math was absolute. She had enough coin to sustain the clinic for exactly 3 more weeks. Assuming no major territorial skirmish brought a sudden influx of wounded guards to her door. She let that knowledge anchor her with absolute, unyielding certainty. A quiet truth accepting no denial. There was no room for panic. Panic was an indulgence she could not afford. Instead, she leaned over the ledger, analyzing the tax structures imposed by the central pack. The newly appointed magistrates demanded 20% of all coin-coin transactions, completely ignoring the reality of the Borderland barter system. It was an administrative failure, drafted by politicians who had never seen a wolf starve in the snow. Her mind worked through the protective clauses in the Borderland Charter of 1842 as she reviewed the previous month's entries. If she categorized the comfrey treatments as religious charitable offerings rather than medical services, she could legally bypass the latest tariff. It was a dangerous technicality, one that would require arguing against the magistrates' men if they ever bothered to audit a lowly border apothecary. She wrote the reclassification into the ledger, the scratching of her quill the only sound in the quiet room. Closing the ledger, she ran a hand over the embossed leather cover. The problems of the territory could not be solved with a knife and herbs alone. They required a deep, systemic understanding of the laws that strangled them. Clara possessed that understanding, gathered from years of silent observation, when she had been nothing more than an invisible omega in a powerful household. She had learned how the High Court functioned, and more importantly, how it failed. Now she operated in the shadows of those failures, keeping the overlooked people of Oakridge alive through sheer meticulous stubbornness. Her quiet reflection was interrupted by a sound at the clinic's heavy oak door. It was not the frantic, desperate pounding of a mother holding a feverish child, nor was it the rapid, impatient rap of a magistrate's courier demanding immediate attention. It was a single, measured strike against the thick wood. The sound carried a strange, anchoring weight. It was a deliberate calculation that did not ask for permission to enter, but rather announced an inevitable arrival. Clara kept her hands entirely still over the leather-bound ledger. The iron latch lifted with a quiet metallic click. As the door swung inward, a gust of late autumn wind swept across the threshold, dragging brittle, dead oak leaves and the smell of frost across the floorboards. A man stepped into the dimly lit room, carrying a heavy wooden crate of requisitioned medical supplies. At first glance, his appearance perfectly matched the lowest rung of the territorial service hierarchy. He was dressed in coarse, soot-stained linen, the kind of cheap, poorly woven fabric issued to provincial stable hands and scullery workers. His grey wool tunic was frayed at the hem, and a clumsy, mismatched patch covered the left elbow. Smudges of dark ash and horse dirt were deliberately rubbed into his collar, masking the natural tone of his skin beneath a layer of engineered poverty. Yet, as Clara watched him cross the room, the visual illusion immediately fractured. Her years of medical practice had trained her to read the underlying mechanics of a body, to diagnose exhaustion, hidden pain, or systemic subservience through the geometry of a person's movement. A labourer's body was a map of his suffering. A true worker, burdened by a heavy crate and a lifetime of poor nutrition, would shuffle. The muscles in their neck would bow under the strain. A genuine stable hand would lean back to counterbalance the weight, compensating with his lower spine, his eyes instinctively dropping to the floor in the presence of a stranger or an authority figure. It was a posture born of survival, a physical apology for taking up space. This man did not shuffle. His boots, though fashioned from scuffed, worn leather, did not drag or scuff against her uneven floorboards. They landed with a chilling, unhurried grace, heel to toe in perfect, silent rhythm. He moved with a predatory, calibrated precision that completely defied the heavy physical load in his arms. His spine remained perfectly aligned, his core solid iron. The crate was held steady without a single tremor of strain in his forearms or wrists. He did not shrink into the architecture of the room to make himself small or invisible. Instead, he occupied the physical space the way a lodestone commands iron filings, pulling the entire atmosphere toward him without speaking a single word. He paused near the center of the apothecary, his broad shoulders squared. He did not look down at his boots. His gaze swept the corners of the clinic, tracking the exits, measuring the shadows, and noting the locked cabinet. It was a silent, tactical assessment of the perimeter. It was the exact posture of a man accustomed to commanding battlefields, completely at odds with the rough, dirty linen draping his frame. Clara did not move. She simply let her eyes trace the straight, unyielding line of his posture, recording the physical evidence in her mind. As the heavy oak door finally swung shut behind him, cutting off the bitter northern wind, the displaced air settled around them. The apothecary was usually dominated by the dense, medicinal odors of crushed willow bark, dried rosemary, and damp earth. But as the man stood in the center of her clinic, a new scent began to dissect the heavy herbal atmosphere. It was faint, intentionally buried beneath the superficial smells of ash, stale hay, and horse sweat. To an ordinary observer, the olfactory disguise might have held perfectly. But Clara did not possess ordinary perception. She diagnosed silent lung infections by the trace of copper on a patient's breath. She could detect the subtle sourness of a failing liver long before the skin ever yellowed. She breathed in through her nose, drawing the cold air across her palate, methodically separating the layers of his scent profile with absolute surgical detachment. Beneath the dirt and the cheap wool, there was a sharp, undeniable bass note, pure pine and ozone. It was not the earthy, resinous smell of the local Borderland timber. This was a striking atmospheric scent. It smelled of the clean, biting cold of high-altitude forest air, the specific environment where ancient northern winds sheared against naked granite. It carried a faint, electric crackle, as if a winter storm was trapped beneath his skin. In the strict biological hierarchy of the packs, scent was not merely a byproduct of existence. It was an absolute genetic marker. A scent that carried the electrical charge of ozone and the terrifying depth of ancient pine belonged to only one lineage in the realm. It was the sovereign signature of the Alpha King. A scent designed by nature to demand absolute submission from anyone standing within its radius. It was a biological crown, invisible but infinitely heavier than gold. Clara let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough. Filling every crack, she did not gasp. Her pulse did not accelerate in a sudden flutter of panic or romantic awe. She processed the massive anomaly with the same quiet, clinical objectivity she applied to a complex medical chart. A disguise could hide the fabric a man wore, and soot could mask the cleanliness of his skin, but no amount of rough linen could change the fundamental architecture of his nervous system. The physical data was undeniable, writing a truth that his clothes tried to deny. The man standing before her wore the patched tunic of an invisible servant, yet he possessed the skeletal alignment of a seasoned general and the biological marker of the highest ruler in the territory. The deception was elaborate, likely designed to test the loyalty, the honesty, or the competence of the provincial borders. Most women in her position, upon feeling the heavy, oppressive pressure of a sovereign aura, would have immediately dropped their gaze, instinctively submitting to the biological command woven into his scent. Others might have panicked, stumbling over their words in absolute fear of a royal inspection. Clara did neither. She had spent enough of her life learning to observe without reacting, allowing stillness to shield her from the arrogance of powerful men. She wiped the residual herbal dust from her hands onto her linen apron, her movements steady, measured, and entirely unhurried. She watched him carefully, analyzing the absolute stillness of his chest as he breathed. The stable-boy disguise was flawless in its material execution, but it failed completely against the anatomical and biological truth of his existence. He had brought a king's shadow into a peasant's room, and Clara was perhaps the only person on the border perfectly equipped to read it. The man shifted his weight, his heavy leather boots creaking against the damp floorboards of the apothecary. He cleared his throat, a rough, deliberate sound meant to convey nervous hesitation. "Name's Silas," he muttered, dropping his chin and rounding his broad shoulders in an obvious attempt to diminish his own height. "Magistrate sent me down from the upper estate, said you had the winter liniment ready for the draft horses. I just hired on at the stables last week. Not used to the cold down in this valley yet." He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers smudged with dark ash. It was a passable performance, relying heavily on the soot and the oversized, poorly fitted wool tunic to hide his frame. He kept his hands tucked partially into his pockets as he spoke, but Clara had already caught the shape of his knuckles when he closed the heavy door. They were unmarred by the daily grind of coarse ropes or splintered pitchforks. Instead, pails, silvery scars crossed the webbing of his thumbs. It was the unmistakable mark of a heavy broadsword hilt sliding against skin over a decade of combat training. More telling than his hands or his forced slouch were his eyes. While his head remained respectfully lowered to play the part of a lowly servant, his piercing gaze did not rest on the floorboards. In the span of 3 seconds, she watched his eyes flick toward the oak door behind him, then trace the iron hinges. His vision swept upward, charting the exposed timber joists of the ceiling. He was calculating the structural blind spots of the room before finally resting on the narrow window that faced the northern woods. It was not the nervous scanning of a new stable hand worried about a scolding or a misplaced coin. It was the cold, automatic assessment of a military commander determining exactly how to defend a confined space in the event of an ambush. She understood exactly what was happening. This was a test, the kind of quiet, brutal game played by the High Court, to measure loyalty, intelligence, or weakness in the outer territories. If she acted like a fool, he would dismiss her. If she panicked, he would deem her unfit. The biological truth of his identity was already established by the crushing pressure of his presence in her small room, yet he stood there, demanding she believe the lie of his muddy boots. Clara kept her hands steady against the smooth edge of her work table. She did not gasp. She did not widen her eyes in shock or call out the lie. A lifetime navigating the fragile egos of the pack hierarchy had taught her that panic was a luxury she could afford. The most dangerous wolves were the ones who believed they were in absolute control of a deception. To break that deception loudly was to invite unpredictability, but to accept the lie completely was to surrender her own intellect. She would not perform ignorance for a man who demanded to be seen. Instead of reaching for the jars of equine liniment he had asked for, Clara slowly reached for the heavy iron kettle resting near the dying embers of the hearth. She let the heavy silence stretch between them, deep and deliberate, an unhurried quiet demanding his next move. She did not rush to fill the quiet with nervous chatter or subservient apologies. The stranger stood perfectly still, his false slouch faltering slightly as the seconds ticked by without her immediate obedience. She lifted a clean, glazed clay cup from the high wooden shelf, the singular piece of fine pottery she reserved only for visiting elders. With slow, deliberate precision, she poured the steaming water, The tea leaves swirled in the heat, a slow, mesmerizing spiral that gave her an excuse to keep her eyes lowered for just a fraction of a second longer, cementing her final decision. The scent of crushed rosemary and bitter chamomile rose into the cold air, providing a clean anchor against the overwhelming weight of his presence. She set the cup down on the small wooden table in the center of the room. Next to it, she pulled out the only sturdy oak chair she owned, brushing a non-existent speck of dust from the seat with the flat of her palm. When she finally turned back to face him, Clara did not lower her gaze to the floor. She looked past the soot smeared artificially on his jaw, past the coarse wool of his tunic, and directly into the cold, highly intelligent depths of his eyes. She crossed her hands over her crisp linen apron and dipped her head in a slow, flawless, and deeply respectful bow. It was not the hurried, fearful dip of a Borderland civilian greeting a superior. It was the measured, dignified inclination of a sovereign court emissary acknowledging a ruling monarch. "The liniment is not quite ready," Clara said, her voice quiet, steady, and stripped of any provincial accent. "But the northern wind is bitter today. Please, sit and warm yourself." "The tea is fresh, Your Majesty." The words hung in the frigid air, shifting the entire atmospheric pressure of the clinic in a heartbeat. The stable boy facade evaporated instantly. The man did not gasp or step back in surprise, but the false curve of his spine snapped perfectly straight, returning him to his full, terrifying height. The rustic, hesitant aura he had projected vanished entirely, replaced by the sheer, unyielding weight of the Alpha King. His broad shoulders squared, pulling the rough linen tight across his chest, and his hands came out of his pockets to rest loosely at his sides. For a long, heavy moment, Matthew Sterling merely stared at her. He made no move toward the table or the tea. He did not issue a command, nor did he demand to know how a lowly Borderland apothecary had seen through a physical disguise that had effectively fooled his own High Council members just 3 days prior. He simply watched her, his piercing gaze recalibrating, mentally mapping the geometry of the woman standing so calmly before him. Clara did not fidget under his intense scrutiny. She stood exactly where she was, her breathing even, her hands perfectly still over her apron. They always said an Omega should know her place. Her place, right now, was standing in the center of her own clinic, fully prepared to treat the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories with the exact level of dignity he actually possessed, rather than the lowly status he had pretended to wear. She had chosen not to play his game, refusing to be tested through deception. Pouring the rosemary tea with the precise etiquette reserved for high court emissaries, she allowed the profound stillness to root itself firmly in the room. When she finally spoke, she bypassed the provincial pleasantries entirely, addressing him with the formal, elevated vocabulary reserved exclusively for a visiting sovereign. The formal title hung in the cold air of the timber-framed apothecary, settling over the scarred floorboards like a sudden frost. For a long, measured moment, Matthew Sterling did not move. He did not flinch, nor did he display the panicked confusion of a commoner mistakenly elevated above his station. Instead, he occupied the silence, letting the quiet of the room expand around him before he attempted to dismantle it. When he finally spoke, he dropped his chin, attempting a slouch that his broad shoulders immediately rejected. It was entirely wrong. Clara Vance did not blink. She stood perfectly still beside her drying racks, wiping her hands on her apron with methodical slowness. She listened not just to the words, but to the mechanics of his speech. A true Borderland laborer spoke from the chest, exhausted by the cold, their breath short and shallow. The man standing in her clinic spoke from the diaphragm. His voice possessed the deep, resonant projection of a commander accustomed to having his words carry across vast echoing stone halls. "It is just a delivery," he added, but as he forced the local dialect, his voice caught. A slight, unmistakable crack broke the rough veneer, the linguistic slip of a highly educated tongue fighting against its own ingrained polish. The healer registered the fracture with a subtle tilt of her head. She noted the way his jaw tightened immediately after the slip, the minute flaring of his nostrils as he calculated whether she had noticed the error. The strain of suppressing years of high-culture education in real time was a heavy cognitive load, and she watched him carry it with a physician's detached fascination. He was trying to be small. The effort required to compress that much natural authority into the shape of a servant was immense. "You have a very careful way of standing for a man who claims to shovel hay for a living," she said softly, her tone entirely conversational. She stepped out from behind the counter, leaving her ledger and her brass scales behind. The distance between them was less than 10 paces. Clara crossed it without hesitation. She did not approach him with the nervous deference of a Borderland Omega, nor did she exhibit the defensive aggression of someone feeling threatened. She moved with the steady, undeniable authority of a medical practitioner in her own sanctuary. He tensed as she drew near. It was a micro-expression, a slight shift in his center of gravity, but she caught it. He was unaccustomed to anyone entering his personal space without a formal request or a drawn weapon. She stopped just inches from him. The scent of ozone and ancient pine was overpowering this close, entirely eclipsing the smell of the mud deliberately smeared on his boots. She reached out. She did not ask for permission. She simply extended her hand and gently took his right wrist. The contact was purely diagnostic. Her fingers, stained pale green from crushing comfrey, pressed against the soot-darkened skin of his forearm. Beneath the grime, she felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his pulse. It was slow, too slow for a man who had supposedly just hauled a heavy crate up a frozen mountain path. "A man who works the stables develops a very specific musculature," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of his radial artery before moving down toward his palm. His lower back bows from lifting from the waist. His shoulders round forward. "You, however, hold your spine in perfect vertical alignment. Your deltoids are developed not from hauling grain, but from carrying the weight of a steel cuirass." He stared down at her, his jaw locked. He did not pull his hand away. Clara turned his wrist upward, exposing the palm to the dim grey light filtering through the frost-rimed window. She pressed her thumb against the base of his fingers. A pitchfork or a scythe blisters the lower pads of the fingers. The friction of agricultural labor is horizontal. She slid her touch upward, tracing the thick, calloused ridge along the inner curve of his thumb and the side of his index finger. The skin there was tough as boiled leather, deeply grooved from years of repetitive friction against wrapped wire and heavy steel. "This pattern," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet absolute certainty, "only develops from decades of handling a master-crafted royal broadsword, a heavy hilt balanced for a downward strike, the weapon of a man trained by the sovereign guard." She let go of his hand. Her touch had been brief, analytical, and utterly devastating to his deception. She stepped back, putting a polite, respectful distance between them once more. A servant looks at the floor when he enters a new room, worrying about tracking mud onto the boards, she continued, her eyes rising to meet his directly. "You looked at the exits, the sightlines, and the structural integrity of the roof. You assessed the room for threats before you even registered the cold." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer the silence of a lie being maintained. It was the heavy, atmospheric pressure of a truth being uncovered. The pine scent in the room deepened, thickening with the sudden spike of adrenaline in his bloodstream. The wind rattled the loose glass of the apothecary window, a sharp northern gust that made the hanging bundles of dried yarrow and rosemary sway from the rafters. The small brass weights on her scaling balance clinked together. a tiny metallic sound that only magnified the intense quiet stretching between them. Clara folded her hands neatly over her apron. She refused to let the situation escalate into melodrama. She was not a girl unmasking a trickster. She was a sovereign subject, acknowledging a reality that could no longer be ignored. "You may drop the act," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "There is no one else here to perform for, and I prefer not to speak to a king as if he were a common stranger." The apothecary fell into a profound, heavy stillness. Outside, the northern wind battered against the frosted glass of the small window, rattling the wooden frame. But inside the timber room, the air felt suddenly dense, anchored by the sheer weight of the confrontation. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not take a step backward. She simply stood beside her wooden counter, her hands resting lightly against the scarred edge of the table. Her breathing remained even, measured, the quiet rhythm of a healer who had spent years observing the breaking points of terrified and dying men. The man before her, clad in coarse, soot-stained linen, stopped his performance. The rough, provincial slouch he had so carefully maintained seemed to stiffen. Clara let the silence stretch. She had spent enough of her life learning to read the geometry of a room, calculating threats and survival margins, to know exactly what she was looking at. The dirt smudged across his jaw was a theatrical touch, applied with intention rather than earned through labor. The fabric of his tunic was cheap, but it was perfectly clean beneath the surface layer of dust, smelling faintly of lye soap rather than the stale sweat of a genuine traveler. But it was his eyes that betrayed him entirely. She reached out, deliberately adjusting the lid of a glass jar filled with dried willow bark. The soft clink of glass against glass was the only sound in the room before she spoke. "A servant looks at the floor when he enters," Clara said. Her voice was not accusatory, merely observational, carrying the flat, undeniable weight of a medical diagnosis. "A laborer, a true stable hand sent by a magistrate, walks into an unfamiliar room and immediately searches for the person holding authority. He checks the floorboards, he checks his boots, he hopes he will not be reprimanded for tracking mud across the threshold. He shrinks his posture to avoid taking up too much oxygen." She let her gaze rise, tracing the immovable line of his jaw and meeting his sharp, predatory eyes directly. "You did not look at the floor, you looked at the exits. You calculated the structural integrity of the walls, the distance to the hearth, and the exact placement of my harvesting knife on the cutting board." Clara folded her hands over her linen apron, her fingers steady. "That is the perimeter assessment of a commander who has survived assassination attempts, not a boy who shovels hay. You may drop the act, Your Majesty." The title hung in the cold air. It did not sound like a plea, nor a terrified realization, nor a panicked confession. It sounded like an official record being stamped and filed into an archive. Matthew Sterling occupied silence, the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. For a long, unbroken minute, he simply stood in the center of the cramped clinic, his gaze locked on her face. The quiet that followed was not the tense, brittle hesitation of a man caught in a lie. It was a terrifying kind of stillness, the heavy, impending pressure of a storm that had decided, for the moment, not to break. Then, very slowly, the entire physical architecture of the man shifted. The manufactured slump vanished from his spine. The deliberate, loose-limbed posture of a tired peasant dissolved into the rigid, perfect alignment of a military ruler. Matthew let his shoulders naturally expand back to their sovereign breadth, his chest rising as he took his first unfiltered breath since crossing her threshold. The sheer physical space he commanded seemed to double, occupying the small room's dimensions without apology. The rough wool of his tunic strained against the sudden, unapologetic shift in his musculature. With the physical change came the full, unrestrained release of his scent. The sharp, biting ozone and the deep, ancient timbre of the royal bloodline washed over the smell of Clara's drying comfrey and crushed lavender, drowning the apothecary in the undeniable signature of the Alpha King. It was a pheromonal weight heavy enough to make a lesser wolf drop to their knees in sheer biological submission, instinctively exposing their throat to the apex predator in the room. Clara did not kneel. She kept her chin level, her pulse steady under his intense scrutiny. She refused to let the biological intimidation override her rational mind. A faint, imperceptible change flickered in his eyes, a dark, quiet satisfaction that replaced the calculating distance he had walked in with. He had come to the Borderlands to conduct an elaborate test, dressing himself in rags to measure the greed, vanity, and shallow ambitions of a potential political bride. He had expected a performative display of charity or a crude dismissal of a peasant. He had intended to watch her fail. Instead, the test had been immediately and clinically reversed. She had stripped away his carefully constructed disguise, not with magic, not with a fortuitous warning, but with the cold, undeniable precision of her own intelligence. She had tested his character by exposing his lie with quiet respect. The king reached up and casually wiped a thumb across his jaw, smearing the theatrical soot against his knuckles. When he finally spoke, the forced provincial accent was entirely gone. His true voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated against the floorboards, carrying the unhurried authority of a man who wrote the laws and commanded the armies. The air in the apothecary seemed to thicken, the faint scent of ozone and ancient pine, pressing against the damp timber walls, no longer masked by soot or cheap wool. Clara remained standing behind her work table, her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting quietly in front of her. She did not look at him with the wide-eyed awe usually reserved for a sovereign, nor did she display the calculated deference of a courtier seeking favor. Her gaze was steady, clinical, and profoundly analytical. She answered his statement, her voice low and entirely devoid of flattery, explaining exactly how she had seen through him. A common laborer, she pointed out, a man who spent his life hauling water or carrying feed, developed a specific curvature of the spine. It was a physical resignation to gravity. His shoulders carried a completely different mechanical strain. She described the deep, anchored microtension visible in his upper back, the rigid bracing of muscles trained to hold a defensive line rather than a heavy sack of grain. It was the stance of a man who spent every waking hour expecting an attack from the shadows, a man who carried the survival of an entire territory on his collarbone. She let that knowledge settle into the room, refusing to soften the assessment. Her respect, she clarified, had absolutely nothing to do with the treasury he commanded or the gold stitched into his true garments. It was rooted entirely in the physical evidence of his endurance. She respected the structural isolation of his duty, the relentless, quiet burden of keeping a fragile pack system from collapsing under its own corruption was a weight that had clearly ground into his bones long before he ever put on a servant's disguise. He absorbed her words without a single shift in expression, yet the atmosphere around him fundamentally altered. The defensive stillness of a ruler being scrutinized, slowly, gave way to the profound, quiet shock of being entirely understood. He occupied the silence not with arrogance, but with a sudden, startling vulnerability. For the first time since he had inherited the throne, someone had looked past the terrifying authority of his bloodline and seen the simple, crushing exhaustion of his labor. She saw the mechanics of his survival, and she did not ask him to fix her own. She simply acknowledged the cost of his posture. Without a word, the disguised king stepped forward. He unbuttoned the rough linen jacket he wore, folding it carefully before placing it over the back of an empty wooden chair. He did not summon an aide or demand a better seat. Instead, he pulled up a low, scarred milking stool and sat directly across from her at the heavy pine table. Positioned right between them was her drying comfrey basket, the woven willow sides slightly frayed from years of constant use. Clara watched, maintaining her composed stillness as he reached his large hands into the brittle pile of harvested roots. His fingers were broad, knuckles thick with the calcified remnants of old fractures, and his palms bore the unmistakable smooth silver lines of sword-hilt scars. They were hands built for executing violence, yet as he picked up a fragile stalk of dried comfrey, his grip was startlingly calibrated. He did not crush the delicate fibers. Watching her prior movements, he mimicked her technique flawlessly, snapping the unusable stems and separating the medicinal root onto a clean linen cloth. They fell into a measured, synchronized rhythm, the crisp snap of dried herbs and the faint rustle of willow branches becoming the only sounds in the clinic. As the pile of unprocessed roots slowly shrank, the conversation shifted away from his identity and toward the practical reality of the northern borders. He asked about the supply lines, his voice now carrying the low, resonant cadence of his true station. Clara did not offer him emotional complaints or dramatic pleas for salvation. She provided raw, administrative data. She detailed the delayed wagon routes, the exact percentage of medicinal shortages over the past 3 winters, and the specific toll the localized tax decrees were taking on the poorest pack members. She spoke of frostbite, of rations stretched thin by bureaucratic neglect, and of ledgers that no longer balanced. He listened with absolute focus, his battle-scarred fingers continuing to sort the comfrey without pause. He did not offer hollow royal promises or defensive justifications for the court's failures. He simply processed the information using the steady grounding repetition of the manual labor to anchor the heavy truths she delivered. The exchange was devoid of romantic pretense, built entirely on the solid, undeniable foundation of mutual competence and shared, pragmatic work. Their quiet rhythm was broken when the heavy oak door of the Apothecary shuddered before swinging inward, admitting a sharp gust of late autumn wind and the damp scent of decaying leaves. Clara Vance did not flinch at the sudden intrusion of cold air. She simply wiped the herbal dust from her hands and turned. A woman stood in the threshold, her shoulders hunched against the biting draught, her woolen shawl wrapped tightly around a small, shivering bundle. It was Gemma Finch, the older healer's face, usually set in lines of dry, pragmatic endurance, was pale and drawn tight with exhaustion. In her arms, her young son struggled for air. Pip Finch's breathing was not a normal rhythm. It was a wet, rattling wheeze that echoed terribly in the quiet, timber-framed room. Clara moved immediately. She did not ask questions. She pointed to the low wooden cot near the hearth, her voice a flat, steady anchor in the sudden chaos. He was small for his age, his skin carrying a translucent, greyish pallor. His tiny fingers were locked in a desperate death grip around a small, wooden toy wolf. The carved animal was battered, missing both its ears, the wood worn smooth by years of anxious clutching. The apothecary owner crossed the room, pulling a fresh piece of heavy linen from a drawer. She steeped it in a basin of near-boiling water, infused with thyme and crushed comfrey root. The steam rose in a thick, fragrant cloud, cutting through the sterile cold of the room. Wringing out the excess water, with quick practiced twists of her wrists, she tested the heat against the inside of her own forearm. It left a stark red mark on her skin, but she did not grimace. It was the correct temperature to break the congestion. She approached the cot. The child's chest spasmed violently, his small frame arching off the mattress as a coughing fit seized him. Clara placed a firm, grounding hand on his shoulder. "Easy, Pip," she murmured, her tone low and devoid of frantic pity. "This will be warm. Let the heat do the work." She draped the steaming herbal compress over his narrow chest. The boy let out a muffled whimper, his knuckles whitening around the wooden toy. The younger woman did not pull back. She held the compress in place with gentle, unyielding pressure. Slowly the medicinal vapor began to penetrate his airway. The harsh, rattling wheeze softened into a strained but steady rhythm. From his position near the sorting table, Matthew Sterling watched the entire exchange. The disguised sovereign remained perfectly still, his tall frame blending into the shadows of the room. He observed the exact calibration of Clara's movements, the lack of wasted energy, and the absolute focus she dedicated to the frail child. She treated the boy's vulnerability not with loud, performative grief, but with quiet, effective labor. The wooden toy in the patient's hand scraped against the cot's frame, a small, rhythmic sound that underscores the fragile reality of the borderland. With her son's breathing finally stabilizing under the hot linen, Gemma collapsed into a nearby stool. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling beneath her damp shawl. Clara stepped away from the cot just long enough to pour a cup of steeped willow bark tea, setting it silently on the table beside the visiting healer. The older woman did not reach for the cup. Instead, she lifted her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadowed corner of the room. She noticed the tall man in the rough, soot-stained tunic standing quietly near the drying racks. Assuming he was nothing more than a hired, stable hand delivering supplies, she lowered her voice to a frantic, hushed whisper. "You need to lock the doors, Clara," Gemma urged, her fingers twisting the frayed edges of her shawl. "He is coming, today." Clara wiped her damp hands on her apron, her expression remaining perfectly level. Reginald Crook. The name hung in the air, bitter and heavy. The local tax collector had been a creeping sickness over the Oak Ridge territory for months. The anxious mother leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower, laced with the raw panic of someone who had nothing left to lose. "He was at the lower market this morning," Gemma continued, her words rushing out in a breathless stream. "He is enforcing the new territorial tax tithes, 2 silver coins for every operational hearth. If you cannot pay, he brings the guards to board up the windows and seize the property." Clara looked at the small coin box resting on her desk. It held copper, not silver. If the clinic closed, children like Pip would have nowhere to go when the winter fevers took hold. The outer settlements would be left to freeze while the inner pack elites debated administrative theory in warm halls. 2 silver coins is a month's wage for a lumberjack, the apothecary owner stated, her voice devoid of outrage, noting only the mathematical impossibility. "He knows the borderland cannot produce that." "He does not care," Gemma choked out, her gaze fixed on her sleeping son. "He evicted the miller's widow yesterday, left her in the snow. He says it is a royal mandate that the sovereign demands the packs pay their share for the upcoming war provisions. If he shuts this apothecary down, Clara, Pip will not survive the next frost." In the corner, the stable hand shifted his weight. It was a minuscule movement, nothing more than the slight creak of a leather boot against the floorboards, but the air pressure in the room immediately dropped. Clara caught the subtle, dangerous change. Matthew's jaw had locked into a rigid line, and his large hands, previously resting loose at his sides, were now curled into tight, bloodless fists. Gemma shrank back slightly, intimidated by the sudden, suffocating heaviness radiating from the disguised man, though she did not understand its source. Clara did not look at Matthew. She reached out and adjusted the cooling compress on the boy's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his ribs. Let the corrupt collector come, she thought, allowing a grim resolve to harden within her chest. Reginald Crook relied on fear and uneducated compliance to rob the desperate. He was about to find out that this particular clinic did not operate on fear. It operated on paper, ink, and the absolute precision of the law. The heavy oak door of the apothecary was pushed inward with a violence that sent a shudder through the timber frame. A gust of bitter late autumn wind swept into the room, scattering loose dried leaves across the floorboards. two large men in heavy leather coats stepped through the threshold, their boots tracking freezing mud onto the clean planks. They acted as a physical barricade for the man who followed them inside. Reginald Crook stepped out of the freezing draft and into the warmth of the clinic, wearing his minor bureaucratic status like a shield. He was dressed in a tailored coat of dark plum wool lined with silver fox fur. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, entirely untouched by the mud his guards had just tracked in. He walked past Clara with a slow, deliberate arrogance, his eyes scanning the modest wooden shelves lining the far wall. In his right hand, Crook carried a walking cane capped with a heavy sphere of solid gold. He raised it, letting the metal catch the dim grey light from the window, and tapped the head of the cane against the side of a large glass apothecary jar. A sharp, hollow clink rang through the room. The jar was nearly empty. He moved to the next jar and tapped it again. Another hollow ring echoed off the timber walls. He moved down the line, striking glass after glass, letting the echoing emptiness of her inventory announce her financial vulnerability without saying a single word. He was a ledger keeper of misery, extracting power by measuring exactly how little his victims had left. "It sounds like poverty, Miss Vance," Crook said, his voice a smooth, oily drawl that carried the precise diction of the capital's lower administrative courts. A tragic sound. It suggests a business failing to thrive, which is a drain on the Oak Ridge territory. The new territorial tax decree requires an immediate supplemental payment from all independent commercial properties. 50 silver coins due by sunset today. I am here to collect. Clara stood perfectly still behind her work table. She analyzed his posture the same way she analyzed a patient, noting the slight puffiness around his eyes that suggested excessive wine, and the rigid grip on his cane that betrayed a desperate need for control. 50 silver coins is not a tax, Clara said, her voice even and devoid of panic. It is an extortion fee. The standard provincial assessment for a medical dispensary of this size is less than 5 silver coins a year. You are attempting to enforce a decree that does not apply to this jurisdiction. Crook smiled patronizingly. Jurisdiction is determined by those who collect the coin. You will pay the 50 silver, or my men will begin the process of liquidating your remaining assets to cover the debt to the crown. In the corner of the room, still wearing the soot-stained linen of a stable boy, Matthew stopped moving. As Crook's guards took a heavy step forward, the air in the small clinic fundamentally changed. The ambient temperature seemed to drop, replaced by a sudden heavy stillness that settled over the timber walls. The scent of ancient pine and ozone spiked, sharp and metallic, carrying the undeniable biological weight of an apex predator preparing to strike. Matthew's knuckles turned bone white, where his hands gripped the edge of the wooden counter. His broad shoulders shifted into the unmistakable stance of a military commander, assessing the fastest trajectory to snap a man's neck. To witness a corrupt bureaucrat threaten a woman in a space of healing was an offense that pack law historically punished with summary execution. His jaw locked, his eyes narrowing into cold slits as he calculated how long it would take to disarm the two guards and force Crook to his knees. He took half a step forward. The floorboards creaked under his sudden shift in weight. Clara moved faster. She did not reach for him, nor did she cry out. Instead, she turned her head just enough to catch his line of sight. Her eyes met his, dark and absolute. It was a sharp, piercing look, a gaze that carried no fear of the guards, no panic over the gold-plated cane, and most importantly, no desire to be rescued. Her stare was a physical anchor. It was a silent, unyielding command, delivered with the precise authority of a woman who knew exactly how to manage a crisis. The message was written in the rigid set of her shoulders and the steady cadence of her breathing. This was her clinic. This was her fight. He was not to interfere. Matthew froze. The absolute clarity in her eyes halted the violence surging through his veins. No one had ever dared to look at the Alpha King and silently order him to stand down. Generals bowed to him. Council members trembled when his scent spiked with aggression. But this quiet apothecary was actively restraining the most dangerous man on the continent to protect her own legal agency. Slowly, deliberately, Matthew let out the breath he had been holding. The crushing atmospheric pressure in the room receded just a fraction. He eased his grip on the counter, uncurling his white-knuckled fingers one by one. He stepped back into the shadows of the corner, returning to the posture of a silent observer, but his eyes never left her face. He surrendered the floor to her, deferring to her sovereignty within these 4 wooden walls. Satisfied that the disguised king was holding his temper, Clara turned her attention back to the corrupt tax collector. Crook had not noticed the lethal exchange behind him. He was too busy admiring the polished gold sphere of his cane. "You mentioned liquidating assets for the crown," Clara said softly, her voice carrying the terrifying calm of a river running deep beneath winter ice. "A bold claim, Mr. Crook. Let us discuss the crown's actual laws." Clara turned her back on the local official. She walked toward the heavy oak cabinet standing in the darkest corner of the apothecary. The floorboards creaked under her soft leather boots, the only sound breaking the heavy pressure filling the small clinic. She reached deep into the front pocket of her apron and withdrew a small, cold iron key. The metal was smooth, worn down by years of being turned in the exact same lock. She slid it into the brass keyhole. The mechanism engaged with a sharp, heavy click that echoed off the timber walls. Reginald Crook let out a short, dismissive breath. He tapped his leather-bound ledger against his thigh, the heavy brass corners of the book thudding against his coat. He spoke in the clipped, impatient cadence of a man who firmly believed his minor bureaucratic status made him untouchable. He warned her that stalling would not change the territorial tax assessment, nor would it prevent his guards from seizing the clinic's inventory if the coin was not produced. Clara did not look over her shoulder. She did not tighten her jaw. She simply opened the cabinet doors. The shelves were lined with dark glass vials, tightly corked jars of dried roots, and carefully labeled ceramic pots. She ignored all of them, reaching instead for a flat, shallow box resting on the bottom shelf. The wood was simple pine, unvarnished but polished smooth by constant handling. She lifted it with both hands, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of it. She carried the box back to the main examination table, moving with the deliberate, unhurried precision of a surgeon preparing an operating theatre. She set the box down beneath the hanging oil lamp. She unfastened the small brass latch. Inside lay the Borderland Charter of 1842. The document was folded twice, the heavy vellum stiff and yellowed at the creases. It smelled faintly of dry dust, old beeswax, and the deep, resinous scent of archives that had not seen sunlight in decades. Clara lifted the parchment by the extreme edges, her fingertips applying only the barest necessary pressure. The material was fragile, prone to cracking, if handled with anything less than absolute respect. She unfolded it upon the table, smoothing the margins flat against the scrubbed wood. At the bottom of the page, anchored by a faded silk ribbon, rested the royal wax seal. It was a deep, dark crimson, brittle at the edges but entirely intact. The crest of the ancient sovereign lineage was pressed deeply into the wax, the intricate lines of the wolf and the crown catching the amber glow of the candlelight. Clara positioned the document carefully, ensuring that the seal was the first thing the light hit. Crook stepped forward, his boots scraping harshly against the floor. He glanced down at the parchment. His sneer did not vanish, but the corners of his mouth twitched downward. He leaned over the table, squinting at the faded black ink. He dismissed it aloud, calling it an archaic piece of paper, irrelevant to the new provincial tax decrees signed by the current magistrate. He crossed his arms, leaning his weight on his heels, demanding she stop wasting his time with historical relics. Clara kept her hands resting lightly on either side of the charter. She did not argue. She merely waited for him to finish speaking, letting his arrogant words hang in the cold air until they sounded hollow. Clara traced the line of text with her index finger, not actually touching the fragile vellum, but hovering just a fraction of an inch above the ink. The script was dense, written in the highly formal, structured syntax of the old court. She did not need to read it. She had memorized every syllable, every comma, and every defining boundary line years ago. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute, undeniable weight of structural law. She recited the fourth clause of the territorial agreement. She detailed the specific exemptions granted to Borderland apothecaries operating more than 50 leagues from the central keep, provided they treated the sovereign pack's dependents without demanding upfront silver. The archaic legal vocabulary flowed from her lips, smoothly, precise and unyielding. She outlined the jurisdictional limits of the district magistrate, citing the exact precedent that explicitly barred local tax collectors from assessing medicinal inventories as commercial goods. Crook's face began to lose its color. He opened his mouth to interrupt, to reassert his authority, but Clara did not pause. She used the rhythm of her speech to block his objections, maintaining a steady, measured cadence. She pointed to a specific line near the royal seal. She explained that the sovereign territorial agreement superseded any localized decree passed by a provincial council, unless that decree was countersigned by the Alpha King himself. She then asked Crook, her tone perfectly flat, if his newly minted leather ledger contained the king's personal signature. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight, not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Crook stared at the dark red wax, his arrogant posture deflated, his shoulders slumping slightly as the mathematical and legal reality of his situation became clear. He looked down at his own ledger, the brass corners suddenly seeming less like a symbol of power and more like evidence of his own gross administrative overreach. Clara watched his eyes dart back and forth across the charter, processing the irrefutable proof that he had zero legal jurisdiction over her clinic. In the corner of the room, still dressed in his rough, soot-stained linen, Matthew stood perfectly still. He did not cross his arms. He did not shift his weight. He simply watched Clara with an intensity that made the air around him hum. He observed the way she dismantled a corrupt official without raising a hand, without raising her voice, using nothing but documented truth and flawless intellectual competence. She had taken the bureaucratic machinery that men like Crook used to crush the vulnerable, and she had weaponized it against him. Clara finally stepped back from the table. She folded her hands neatly in front of her apron. She informed the tax collector that if he attempted to seize her inventory, she would not fight his guards. Instead, she would file a formal grievance with the Central Archive, citing a direct violation of a sealed sovereign treaty, a crime that carried the penalty of permanent exile from the Pack lands. She suggested, very quietly, that he take his ledger and leave her clinic before the snow began to fall. Reginald Crook stared at the heavy vellum of the century-old pact, his lips pulling back over his teeth in a sneer of desperate arrogance. Men who built their careers on exploiting the vulnerable rarely surrendered at the first sight of an opposing ledger. He leaned over the counter, attempting to physically crowd the narrow space. The air felt thick, the cloying scent of his cologne clashing violently with the clean, medicinal smell of drying herbs. He tapped the fragile parchment with one polished fingernail, his voice dripping with condescension. He argued, in a sharp nasal tone, that the old sovereign seal held no weight in the modern administration. He insisted that a document signed decades ago by a dead ruler could not possibly override the current magistrate's territorial decree. It was a bluff, an act of sheer intimidation designed to confuse an uneducated woman into submission. He demanded that Clara surrender her coin box immediately, or face the physical seizure of her clinic. Behind him, his guards shifted their weight, their leather armor creaking in a choreographed display of impending violence. Clara did not move. She kept her hands resting lightly on the counter, her posture a quiet refusal to be diminished by loud men. She knew the foundational law of the territory. But before she could calmly recite the exact succession clause that made the document perpetually binding, the atmospheric pressure in the room altered. Matthew stepped forward. He did not draw a weapon. He did not issue a command. He did not utter a single syllable of warning. The man, dressed in the coarse, soot-stained linen of a lowly stable hand, simply closed the distance between the back wall and the counter. His heavy boots moved with terrifying, silent precision, yet the entire room seemed to tilt on its axis. The temperature dropped abruptly, not from the cold draft outside, but from the sudden, suffocating pressure of an apex predator occupying the space. The scent of ozone and ancient pine flared, sharp and electric, obliterating the sour smell of the tax collector's cologne. Matthew came to a stop just a fraction of an inch behind Clara's right shoulder, positioning himself as an immovable barrier. He did not touch her. He merely stood there, his broad shoulders squared, his hands clasped loosely behind his back in a military parade rest. He tilted his chin down, leveling a dead, hollow gaze directly at the corrupt official. The sheer physical mass of him cast a long, suffocating shadow over the counter, eclipsing Crook's paperwork. It was a masterclass in the geometry of dominance. Without raising his voice, without lifting a finger, the disguised king projected a physical threat so absolute that the guards instinctively took a half step backward, dropping their hands from their weapons. The silence that fell over the apothecary was the heavy, breathless stillness of a forest right before the storm breaks. Crook's sneer faltered, the blood draining from his face as his survival instincts overrode his bureaucratic arrogance. He looked at the silent, stable hand, his eyes widening in terror as his brain struggled to reconcile the rough peasant clothing with the terrifying aura of a sovereign alpha. The physical reality of the situation crashed down on Reginald Crook with the weight of a collapsing roof. He was a minor official, a man who relied entirely on the perceived authority of his office to extract wealth from those who could not fight back. But the law, as presented in the undeniable ink of the ancient royal decree, stood firmly against him, and the physical violence he usually relied upon was entirely neutralized by the terrifying, silent man standing behind the apothecary counter. The guards he had paid to enforce his will were practically pressing their backs against the doorframe, their eyes locked on Matthew in unblinking, primal fear. Crook swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply in his thin throat. He tried to maintain the illusion of control, to salvage some fragment of his dignity, before he was forced to retreat. He lifted a hand to adjust the rich fur collar of his winter cloak, an affected gesture meant to convey boredom and superiority. But his fingers betrayed him. They trembled violently against the dark pelt, the fine tremor moving all the way up his wrist as the adrenaline of pure fear flooded his system. He looked down at his own tax ledgers, the fresh ink, suddenly looking fragile and worthless compared to the ancient wax seal Clara had presented. He reached out to gather his documents, his hands shaking so badly that he knocked a small wooden vial off the counter. It clattered against the floorboards, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence, but neither Clara nor Matthew flinched. Clara simply watched him, her expression a mask of cool, clinical observation, while Matthew continued to hold the space with the unyielding gravity of a lodestone. "Very well," Crook managed to say, his voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. "If you wish to hide behind outdated parchment, that is your choice. But the magistrate will hear of this insubordination." It was an empty threat, hollow and brittle, and every person in the room knew it. Clara did not bother to offer a response. She did not argue, she did not gloat, and she did not ask him to leave. She simply allowed the silence to stretch, forcing him to occupy the awkward, humiliating reality of his own defeat. Unable to withstand the suffocating pressure of the disguised king's gaze for another second, Crook snatched his rolled ledgers from the timber surface. He turned on his heel, nearly stumbling over the uneven threshold in his haste to escape the clinic. His guards did not wait for an order. They shoved the heavy oak door open and scrambled out into the freezing northern air, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the terrifying stable hand. The door slammed shut behind them, the latch clicking sharply into place. Outside, the crunch of their boots on the frozen gravel faded rapidly down the path, leaving the apothecary to the quiet hum of the boiling kettle. The threat had been entirely dismantled, broken not by drawn steel or spilled blood, but by the precise application of administrative truth and the quiet weight of true sovereignty. Clara remained standing behind the counter, her breathing even, her hands steady as she rested her fingertips against the edges of the open charter. The heavy oak door remained closed, cutting off the bitter northern wind and the retreating footsteps of Reginald Crook. The apothecary fell into a profound, ringing silence, hollowed out by the sudden absence of the tax collector's heavy boots. Clara did not immediately move. She kept her fingers pressed against the edges of the faded parchment, feeling the dry, brittle texture of the historical document under her fingertips. Her knuckles were pale, the blood drained from her hands. The tension of the encounter vibrated in the floorboards, but she forced her breathing to remain slow and even, refusing to let the adrenaline dictate her posture. Behind her, the floorboards creaked as Matthew stepped away from the shadows. The shift in his presence was absolute. The slight hunch in his shoulders, the deferential tilt of his chin, the final lingering layers of the stable boy persona vanished completely. When he finally spoke, the rustic cadence and provincial slang were entirely gone. He adopted the precise, unhurried cadence of a man accustomed to addressing the High Council chamber. It echoed in the small timber room, vibrating against the jars of dried roots and glass tinctures. The exemption of medical sanctuaries operating outside the sovereign tax grid, provided they treat the indigent without prejudice. Clara turned slowly. The man, standing near the hearth, still wore the rough, soot-stained linen of a labourer, but his syntax belonged to the royal archives. "My own advisers," Matthew continued, taking a slow step toward the centre table. "Men whose families have sat on the High Court for 3 generations struggle to navigate the jurisdictional overlaps of the outer territories. They spend weeks debating precedents in warm council rooms." He stopped across the table from her, his gaze dropping to the open charter, then lifting to meet her eyes. "Yet you dismantled a corrupt regional magistrate, using a century-old loophole, quoted flawlessly from memory, while standing in a freezing clinic." Clara released her grip on the parchment, smoothing the edge flat. A magistrate relies on fear. Fear requires momentum. If you disrupt the momentum with specific legal documentation, the fear collapses. It is merely a matter of knowing the architecture of the law. Matthew watched the steady movement of her hands. The scent of ozone and ancient pine seemed to thicken in the enclosed space, a heavy, atmospheric pressure that demanded acknowledgement. "It is a matter of exceptional administrative intelligence," he corrected quietly. "You did not just defend your clinic, you executed a flawless defense of the sovereign territory's original intent." Not a single scribe in my capital could have delivered that verdict with such cold precision. He did not reach across the table to touch her. He maintained the physical distance, honoring the boundary she had established the moment he entered her apothecary. Instead, he pulled out the wooden chair, the one he had occupied earlier, and sat. The movement was deliberate, stripping away the remaining artifice of his disguise. Clara observed the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw that the soot could no longer mask. "They told me I needed to select a Luna by the winter solstice," Matthew said, his voice dropping into a quieter register. He rested his forearms on his knees, clasping his uncalloused, scarred hands together. The capital held a continuous procession of candidates. Women from the wealthiest families, draped in imported silks, carrying themselves with practiced grace. They looked at the throne. They looked at the gold reserves, the military banners, the title. He looked down at his own rough linen sleeves, a faint cynical curve touching his mouth. None of them saw the ledgers. None of them saw the border disputes, the failing grain routes, or the cost of maintaining the treaty lines. They wanted the crown. They did not want the kingdom. Clara remained standing, her back straight, listening to the cadence of his confession. She did not offer platitudes. She understood the exact nature of the isolation he was describing. It was the isolation of holding up a structure that everyone else merely wanted to live inside. The Borderland taught the same lesson. The people who needed her tinctures rarely asked how she sourced the ingredients in the frozen earth. "So you disguised yourself," Clara stated, her tone neutral, analytical, though her fingers carefully aligned the edges of the charter on the pine wood, to find out who would treat a laborer with dignity. A simple moral trap for the arrogant. "No," Matthew corrected, his gaze snapping back to hers, sharp and uncompromising. "To find a woman who could see reality. I did not need a bride who would perform kindness for a peasant. I needed a partner who could read a room, assess a threat, and understand the weight of duty. When I walked through your door, I expected to test your charity. Instead, within 5 minutes, you diagnosed my military history, analyzed my stride, and identified my sovereign scent. You bypassed the performance entirely." He leaned back slightly, the timber chair groaning under his weight. "The women in the capital looked right at my crown and saw nothing but their own ambition. You looked at a dirt-stained shirt and saw the exact physical toll of leadership. You saw the burden, Clara. And instead of playing a game, you addressed me with the respect of an equal." Clara allowed his confession to sink deep into her marrow, taking root with an undeniable finality. The deception had not been a toxic game of power. It had been a desperate strategic maneuver by a ruler suffocating under the weight of his own court. He had hidden his status not to mock her, but to protect himself from the blindness of his peers. The heavy silence of the apothecary stretched, no longer tight with tension, but expansive. Matthew reached inside the lining of his coarse wool jacket, the rough fabric rustling quietly. When his hand emerged, it did not hold a weapon, a coin purse, or a royal summons. He placed a folded stack of heavy, cream-colored parchment on the scarred surface of Clara's pine table, pushing aside the drying comfrey basket to make room. The material was thick, edged in faint gold leaf, and bound by a ribbon of deep sovereign blue. At the center of the binding rested the unbroken wax seal of the Alpha King. Clara looked at the document, then back to the man who had walked in as a stable hand. The scent of ozone and ancient pine filled the space between them, steady and undeniable. Matthew untied the ribbon. The heavy parchment fell open, revealing pages that were entirely blank. There were no pre-written demands, no lists of traditional lunar duties, no clauses dictating her submission or her place within the capital's rigid hierarchy. It was a terrifying, beautiful expanse of emptiness. "A sovereign does not dictate terms to an equal," Matthew said, his voice dropping into the low, resonant cadence of the northern court. The marriages of my ancestors were built on territorial acquisition and biological mandates. I have no interest in either. I require a partner who sees the machinery of the pack, who understands the ledgers, the laws, and the people those laws crush. Clara remained perfectly still, her hands resting on the edge of the timber boards. You are offering a blank treaty. I am offering a blank treaty, he confirmed, sliding a glass inkwell and a brass-nibbed quill toward her. You will write the terms. We will draft this partnership right here, in this clinic. Nothing is signed until you are satisfied with the jurisdiction. She pulled the parchment closer. The paper was smooth beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the rough, splintering wood of her workbench. She dipped the quill into the black ink, the small metallic clink grounding her in the present reality. For the next hour, the only sounds in the apothecary were the crackle of the dying hearth fire and the sharp, deliberate scratching of the nib across the page. They built the contract piece by piece. Clara established clauses protecting the local tax exemptions, reinforcing the original provincial exemptions permanently into royal law. Matthew agreed to every point without hesitation, his eyes tracking the precise, elegant sweep of her handwriting. But when she reached the section detailing her own residence and duties, her pen paused. Before she could write a generic clause about transferring to the capital, Matthew leaned forward. His shadow fell over the table, bringing that sharp scent of winter forests closer. Write this down, he instructed, his tone shifting into something fiercely protective, yet entirely respectful of her boundaries. The title of Luna shall not supersede the title of Regional Director of Borderland Healthcare. You will retain full administrative control over this clinic, the supply routes, and the allocation of medical funds for the outer territories. Clara looked up, her breath catching almost imperceptibly. You are giving me structural authority over the borders, independent of the Crown's treasury. I am giving you nothing, Matthew corrected quietly, his gaze locked on hers. You already built the authority. You already keep these people alive. I am simply ensuring that the legal registry reflects the truth. No elder, no tax collector, and no future magistrate will ever have the jurisdiction to question your work again. The precision of his understanding lodged itself between her ribs like a sliver of warm light. He was not rescuing her from her labor. He was validating it. He was arming her with the highest legal protection the pack possessed. She lowered her head, her posture steady, and carefully wrote his exact words onto the heavy parchment. The final clause was set. The ink on the parchment gleamed wet under the amber light of the single tallow candle Clara had lit. As the afternoon faded into a grey dusk, the document was no longer blank. It was a dense, meticulously structured architecture of mutual respect, administrative reform, and territorial safety. Matthew took the quill from her fingers. He did not brush her hand, did not attempt to turn the exchange of the pen into a moment of unearned physical intimacy. He simply accepted the brass instrument, signed his name at the bottom of the final page with a bold, unhesitating stroke, and pressed the heavy gold signet ring from his pocket into a fresh drop of hot blue wax. The seal burned into the paper, making the treaty undeniable. He set the quill down and stepped back, offering her the space. Clara looked at the signature line waiting for her. She did not feel the frantic, breathless panic of a woman being swept away by royalty. She felt the profound, grounding weight of a healer picking up a scalpel, of a ledger keeper balancing a final, perfect account. She picked up the quill. Her hand did not tremble. With clear, decisive movements, she wrote her name beside his, Clara Vance. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind. As the cold draught seeped through the cracks in the timber walls, the dark letters of her name settled into the parchment, permanent and unyielding. She set the pen beside the inkwell, and walked slowly toward the small, frost-rimmed window of the clinic. Outside the Borderland town was beginning to light its evening fires. The smoke curled into the freezing sky, smelling of burning peat and damp wood. Somewhere down those muddy, rutted streets, Gemma Finch was boiling water for tea, and young Pip was resting under a threadbare blanket, breathing a little easier because of the medicine she had provided. For years, Clara had watched those fires with a quiet, gnawing anxiety, counting the days until the winter would break them, counting the coins that would never be enough to save everyone. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were cracked from the cold, the fingertips stained with black ink and green herbal sap. They were the hands of a servant, a worker, a forgotten Omega. But tonight the math had changed. The ink on the table behind her was not just a marriage vow. It was a shield forged in iron and law. It guaranteed shipments of clean grain, winter wool, and medicinal supplies. It meant that Crook and men like him would never again cast a shadow over this town. It meant that the invisible labor of the Borderlands would finally be seen. Matthew came to stand beside her. He did not wrap his arms around her waist or pull her into his chest. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the same town, the same fires. He occupied the space beside her not as a conqueror claiming a prize, but as a sovereign standing beside his equal. "They will not believe it," Clara said softly, her breath fogging the cold glass. "When the royal carriage arrives tomorrow to announce the treaty, they will look at my apron and my stained hands, and they will not understand." "They will learn," Matthew replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "They have spent their lives confusing fine clothing with true authority. You knew better. You saw the king beneath the soot." Clara rested her forehead against the chilled wood of the window frame, a quiet, deep exhaustion finally giving way to a profound sense of safety. She had spoken to him as if he were the king, because she possessed the intelligence to see the truth, and in return he had handed her the power to rule. No one would ever call her invisible again.